Let's go ahead and get started. Am I talking loud enough in back? Thank you. Good morning and welcome. This is the replacement talk on KSS techniques, and I appreciate your fighting your way through the schedule changes to make it here. I think I have had a chance to meet almost all of you. I'm Joel Burton, and the little piece about me is that I'm a Plone trainer and developer, which a lot of you know. I offer classes on Plone around the world. The more important part about this really is the last bullet point, which is I am totally and completely not an expert in JavaScript. And by expert, I mean intermediate user, and by not intermediate user, I mean my some knowledge is stuff like pop up the alert box and copy code from your website and paste it into mine. Now, that's good, because my whole talk is about how you can do interesting dynamic things without having to know JavaScript. But I will give you the warning that if you ask me hard JavaScript questions, I will deflect charmingly and change the subject. So there you go. I want to talk about why KSS is so fantastic. We do have more people coming, it looks like. So if you do have some space to your side, please push in. I'd hate to have people have to sit in back just because there isn't space for them to grab a seat. Thank you. I want to talk about why KSS is so fantastic. Plone 3 introduced a number of really great things, some of which you had to learn about. You have to learn a bit about viewlets, whether you want to or not, because you have to know them to theme a site in Plone 3. KSS fell into the, I can build a site without having to learn it, and I think that in some ways that may have been a mistake, because it's really one of the most fun, easy, well-designed parts of Plone 3. I hope you get a sense that this is not hard stuff. This is stuff you can leave here today and play with. KSS gives us the chance to add dynamic behavior to our site without writing JavaScript and without having to maintain JavaScript. So I'll talk about the benefits of it. I'll talk about doing things in the client, in the web browser, for which you might have written fairly ordinary JavaScript, but the convenience of not having had to do so. And then the real benefit comes in doing server-side processing, what a lot of people would call AJAX-style techniques in KSS. So how can you ask the server to update information, get a response back, see the happy little flashing message, not have the full page refresh, things like that. All of that AJAX magic we can do with KSS. I do have my handouts online at plonebootcamps.com/resources. I will show you that URL at the end, don't worry. And so I have at the end of the presentation some material I'm just going to hand wave through, which is essentially a reference guide for you to take home for KSS. So there's going to be 15 slides at the end that I'm just going to prove to you exist, and I'm not going to walk you through them. So what's the problem with JavaScript? It's a nice language. Every one of the 7 times I've learned it, I thought it was really cool. You know, nice, simple, straightforward language. The problem for most of us isn't really JavaScript, of course. It's that even years and years and years in, there's still too much you have to learn about the browser environment, small differences in the browser requirements, and small differences in browser security, and all the stuff around where the JavaScript is actually running. And so for most of us, you either become a JavaScript expert, or you sort of stayed a permanent JavaScript newbie / when your boss says things like, can we do something more dynamic? You do the whole la 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 la, I can't hear you. That was me. Even if you are, though, a JavaScript expert, even if you can do all of this stuff in JavaScript, what's fantastic about KSS is you can only do it once and have that once be in Python. Because for most of us, it's not good enough to have your validation, your updating, your pricing, your shopping cart, your whatever happen in JavaScript, because what happens when the user turns off JavaScript? If they're on a browser where they can't turn it on for security reasons, if they're on a text browser that doesn't support it. So KSS lets us do an amazing thing. It lets us write the web application as if JavaScript doesn't exist. And then, in a totally separate, very tiny way, add what will ultimately be JavaScript-oriented behaviors to it. And that, for me, is the best part. You write it the way you always have. Nothing about your templates, nothing about your Python has to change. KSS stands for Kinetic Style Sheets. It's actually useful to noodle in your brain for 1 second on that acronym, because it tells you a bit about how this really should feel. I like to say that it has the power of JavaScript and the syntax of CSS. It looks like CSS. When you hover over this button, when you click on this thing, but instead of saying make it blue, underline it, make it blink, now it says things like call the script on the server and update a price here. So the power of JavaScript, but we get to use the syntax of CSS. That's KSS. I will show you lots of KSS, but that's just to prove it to you that it looks like CSS. I can even use the CSX highlighting mode in my editor here because it essentially is the CSS format. We include an AJAX library of our own. KSS itself is possible to have different AJAX libraries under the hood, should that really be a concern of yours. At the moment, we use jQuery as our under the hood KS library that actually powers the JavaScript. And I'm going to start right off with the first example. I will show you on the last slide where you can download the product I'm using here. So all of this code is available. You can install it and play with it, as well as the handouts. But I'm showing you here, there are seats all around. I'm showing you here a super simple web application. I have an input button, and I have a little message. You have a chance to type into a form, or in this case, push a button. That's a very simple sort of call and response web app. And then I'm going to show you either what you typed, or in my case, I'm just showing you the same message. So if you push the button, show a message. This is not KSS. This is just how you would do it in standard Plone. I'm going to go ahead for a second, turn off JavaScript just so I can show you what it looks like without KSS. Nothing amazing there. I click, I resubmit. A lot of you saw my little browser flash. I got a new page back, and I got a standard request. I'll turn on my JavaScript. I'm using exactly the same HTML, and it really is this HTML. There's nothing in here about KSS. And now, just pull it up fresh. Watch carefully, no browser refresh. I'll get immediate feedback. My HTML doesn't change. It doesn't even know this behavior is being attached. That's the fantastic part about it. And here's what that KSS looks like. This is the total solution. There's no secret parts I'm hiding to obscure complexity from you. When you click on the log button, I want to do something in the client, and I want to say clicked via KSS. It looks like CSS. A lot of you could read this like CSS in your brains if you know CSS. How many of you have at least a passing knowledge of CSS? So this should look very familiar, sort of ideologically, syntactically to you, both in the spelling and also in the sort of way you express the idea. When I click on that log button, do something on the client, and what am I doing? We will always say, what is it that we're doing something to? What is the identifier we're looking for? For simplicity's sake, I put an HTML ID directly on that log button, but KSS supports all the CSS ways of selecting things. So I could have said, it's the button with this class inside of this thing with this class inside of this element, any way you would normally drill down in CSS to find a selector, I can do here. What's the event? I'll show you a list of events later on. They're very, they're very JavaScript-like. So if you know click, double click, mouse up, mouse down, those things, those are the events. And I'll give you a nearly complete list in the reference section. Am I doing something on the client or the server? And what am I doing? And then, what parameters do I need to pass? Essentially, what's the other information I need to say? This will always start with the action you're doing, because you can do several actions. I could say, pop up an alert box and replace some HTML. And so my parameters would say alert dash, whatever the parameters for alert box are, replace HTML dash, whatever the parameters for replace HTML are. So this is basically the way of associating this parameter with this action. Questions about the syntax? Excellent. Here is a slightly more sophisticated example, again with this kind of call and response sort of simple application. Now, I'm not popping up an alert box. I'm replacing some HTML. And this is what we actually saw running here was I'm not getting an alert box. I'm getting a little snippet of HTML on the page being replaced. Replace HTML. Again, this is client side. My parameters will all use the actual action. So you'll see all my parameters start with the replace inner HTML. Inner just mean keep the div, paragraph, bold, whatever that I'm replacing on. Keep that element and replace what's inside of it. I'm looking for something called hash message. That's a HTML ID. And you can see that that is going to be here. That's a little paragraph. I'm keeping the paragraph. I'm filling it with whatever the message is. And then what's the message I'm actually filling it with. This is, if you want to think about it this way, the sort of tell content of KSS. This is the 90% of the time for straightforward examples what you're going to do. You're going to have some action that calculates, thinks, does something, and replaces some placeholder, ID, whatever, in your HTML. Questions or problems about that? Okay. There's the paragraph that I was affecting, how it originally looked, and I'm just replacing the inside of that. Now, normally, when I push a button, the submit button for a form, what happens? The form gets submitted. Our goal with KSS is for you to never have to change your HTML. You should never have to edit your HTML. You should never have to have it be aware that KSS is going to happen. And so the very last little piece you'll commonly add is the form is a perfect, fully functioning form with a real submit that gets back a real web page. If KSS is running and there's just one line added here and that's that first line of my declarations, essentially don't do the normal thing. Don't actually submit the form and get back a new page. Otherwise, what would happen is I would get the KSS message flashing for a second, and then I would go ahead, as my browser always does, when you click a submit button on an HTML form, and get back the new page. You will almost always do this, especially with the kind of pushing buttons, typing things and such, because you don't want the kind of more boring, straightforward, full page request-oriented things to happen. Questions or problems about that? Okay. I can also do more interesting things. Like previously, if you look at the last line, you'll see the last line is the part that's changing. Instead of pumping out a static message, here, I could look in my form, look in my current form for the form variable called note. That's just a name that I made up, but that could be an input box where you type in the message you want. So these parameters, of course, don't have to be static. We have several different parameter providers. Where can this information come from? In this case, look on the current form, look for the input field. It could be an input text box. It could be a lot of other things, of course, you know, but look for that. And that's what I want to replace inside of the message ID. And I would, of course, add that to my HTML. These KSS files are just files. You can put them in your custom folder. You can put them in your on-disk product skin folder. You can register them as ZOP3 page templates. You can use DTML if you want. You can do them however you want. They're just a text file. So any way that you like to handle your CSS in Plone, you can handle your KSS. Just like we have a tool for managing CSS and managing JavaScript, we have a tool for managing what KSS gets sent out. And I will show you that here. It's called portal_KSS. And it lists all of the KSS files that we send out. And if you create your own file, as I did here, all you have to do is come and tell it its name. Now, I've created my file in a rather unusual way. As a ZOP3 wired resource, a lot of you are most likely to drop it into your custom folder, put it into a standard product, in which case you would just say, you know, my.kss here. And we will send that KSS file out. We also have a debug development mode for KSS, which is exactly the same as it is for CSS and JavaScript. It means don't merge all the KSS, don't cache the KSS. If you check that, it's going to be a bit slower, but you'll be able to edit your CSS and see the changes live, just like we have for CSS and JavaScript. Questions or problems about the mechanics, where this KSS file goes, how you have to tell us that you have one, how you cannot cache it. It's pretty straightforward if you've done any CSS or JavaScript in Plone. We'll look at some more sophisticated examples. The rest of the examples we're going to look at are not purely client-side. They're going to involve us asking the server to do a calculation, getting the answer, and changing the answer in the web page without having to request the whole web page. They're going to be AJAX-y. And let's take a look at the first of these. I'll show you what it looks like, and then I'll show you the HTML. This is an order form application. I'm again going to turn off JavaScript for a moment so you can see it work in the standard way. It's an order form for the highly mythical book Megaplone Development. You can tell me how many copies you want of it. 9 copies. I push update. This is non-KSS, so you'll see a whole browser page request, and that's $179. It's an incredibly simple standard boilerplate page template. There's no KSS stuff here. This is just the HTML pumping out the number of copies you may have already asked for. So of course, once you give us an answer, we'll show you how many it was you wanted, showing you how much the cost was. And ultimately, this may rely on something as simple as a little tiny Python script like this. So this is how you might build this in a standard Plone 2, Plone 3 kind of way if KSS didn't exist. And a lot of us build applications just like this. I'll turn KSS on by enabling my JavaScript. Show you that application again. I want 8 copies of Megaplone Development. No page request, immediate update. Now, I could have, of course, put the calculation client side. I could have written a lot of JavaScript that multiplies this. But a lot of you know you don't want to have to maintain pricing calculators in front end and back end. That would be ridiculous. Huge, very error prone, very maintenance error prone. Instead, we're calling the exact same script. I'm not maintaining 2 scripts or 2 different scripts to do this kind of pricing calculation. Here's the KSS I could use for this, and in fact, the KSS that I am using for this. Don't do what normally would be done. Don't actually submit the form. So when you click that update button, don't submit the form. Call a new script that we're going to write called KSS order calculate. I'll show you that script in a second, of course. And then what am I doing in that last line? I'm looking in my current form for that box called num copies, and I'm passing it to that KSS order calculate script. I'm going to show you this both in a Zope2 Plone 2 custom folder sort of way, and I'm also going to show it to you in a Zope3 Plone 3 ZCML wired browser view kind of way. It works great both ways. Here's this idea written for those of us that are working with things like the skinning machinery from the CMF. Here's how I would write this KSS order script. There's some boilerplate stuff at the top. That's just boilerplate, importing some commands we need. Some boilerplate stuff to basically say, start the KSS machinery. Don't worry, this is just dead chicken waving. You just copy and paste it. Here's the part that actually gets the answer, and I'm just using the script I already wrote. So I'm just calling it. There's nothing unusual about that. Call the order calculate, pass it the number of books you want. Here's the part where I'm actually using KSS. Replace inner HTML. Notice that's exactly the same command I used before. Replace inner HTML, again, is sort of the tal content of KSS, if you will. I am replacing the total ID, which is the little text box or input box or such where I want to show the total amount. And I'm replacing it with, of course, whatever I said, $200 or such, the total amount. And then some boilerplate at the end. You'll always have in these to say, OK, I'm done. Render this as KSS. Questions about that idea? I could have actually moved the mathematical logic of calculating book prices into this. That would work just fine. I would consider that a sort of architectural error because then I'd have that same code both in the old way and the new way. I like to do it like this. This essentially becomes a wrapper just to do the KSS scaffolding and returning, and then call the original same script to actually do the calculations. Yeah, Lee.
You have that where you're saying the replace inner HTML.
Yep.
So that's getting kind of hidden into here as opposed to being in the KSS where you would see it all in one place where you're affecting.
I could also have my KSS call this script, get back the results, and then have a second action in my KSS, which says take the thing I got back from the first action and do things. If you prefer to think about it that way, you could certainly do it that way if you feel like this behavior is too hidden. I didn't do it that way here because I wanted the sort of simplest KSS I could get away with. In all cases, you will need a script that is KSS specific. It'll be one line shorter in that case, but you'll need a script that just provides a little bit of wrapping. One sort of, I think, obvious improvement UI-wise, I change the number, I push update, I get an immediate answer. What would obviously be a more intuitive UI here for this kind of nifty Ajaxy application? Yeah, Danny. Anytime I change the number, just change the price. Why do you have to go and push a button? How HTML1 is that, you know? I write the application as if KSS doesn't exist. We do need that button sometimes. When do we need that button? If they don't have JavaScript and the only thing they can do is submit the form. Now, a lot of you know that sometimes you don't need an input button. Sometimes your users can press enter into text boxes. I'm here to tell you that a lot of your users don't know that, so you may want to keep those submit buttons around until you get smarter users. But that aside, we can write the application as if KSS doesn't exist. What am I doing here at the top? It's very interesting, very common KSS idiom. When this page gets loaded, that update button is just yanked out of the HTML. It's not hidden visually like, CSS display none. It's actually removed from the DOM. So there is no input button. And when we change the number of copies, we call the script. I have this already in my KSS. I just had it commented out before. So let me uncomment that out. I no longer need, it won't hurt me, but I no longer need the behavior for clicking the input button because now I'm actually getting rid of the input button. So I'll delete that. Let me refresh here. I may have to do this with prejudice. Hang one sec, I may have lost my connection with my editor. Let me just pop up and do this slightly more directly. I'll get rid of the click button behavior, and I will uncomment the behavior that said, hide the button, make the change automatically. Save my changes, refresh. The button is now gone, and as soon as I change that number, my price changes. It's the same pattern. Build the application as if KSS doesn't exist, and then someone entirely else can come and add the KSS 3 months later, perhaps even, once you learn about it or have time to add that in. It's a really nice pattern. Questions or problems there? Yeah.
You mentioned that some users don't know that they should hit enter. So in that case, did you tab out that?
Some users may not know they hit tab. In this case, I wanted to give you a whiz-bang cool example. You'll have to decide if that's actually the UI you want. I just want to give you an example that you can sort of change the UI with KSS to make a more JavaScript-y UI. But you'd have to actually decide. You might very reasonably decide to keep the button there and make it so if they push the button or if they tab out, but you'll decide that. I want to just give you an example that you can sort of layer interface changes in KSS that are applicable in a JavaScript-y kind of world. Yeah?
Does the
In my case, my KSS itself says when I change, whatever num copies is the ID I put on that text box where you type the number of copies. So I'm not at this point handling what happens if you type the letter C or if you delete it or things like that. As soon as you change it and press tab, we'll try to calculate it.
Talking about like if you had a larger text box where they're entering something and you don't want to send off requests until they're done.
The change itself is when you move from that element, when you have changed and move focus. That's a little bit of JavaScript that you'd learn or that you'd learn from the KSS, what the actual events happened. It's not firing when you push the 1 in 1.2. It's firing when I type 1.2 tab or 1.2 click somewhere else or 1.2 scroll or anything that causes me to lose focus. There is an event for you have pushed a key in this box, which you might find useful for stuff like don't let them type more than 100 characters or auto-complete as they type or such, but that's not the event I'm using here. Good question. Okay. Again, I can get that update button out by getting rid of it, updating on changes. We'll look at the third of our examples. I'm going to again turn off my JavaScript for a second. So disable all JavaScript. I'm using the web developer extensions here, a really nice plugin for Firefox that gives me this turn on JavaScript, turn off JavaScript real easily. So we're selling all these copies of Megaplone Development. How are we doing? Evil boss every hour can push the button and see how much money we've made, which is entirely random. It's sort of like the US stock market. It just kind of goes up and down without any sense. But, you know, classic push update button to get update kind of old school application. Again, build it as if KSS doesn't exist. Here's the actual method of Python that's doing this. I actually am calculating the number of books randomly, but in real life that would probably be something like a database lookup or such. And then I'm just returning some little dictionary. There's nothing KSS here. This is just a snippet of Python, similar to what you might write for an application like this. And again, nothing magic here. Here's the snippet of page template that says, loop over all the books we sell, call that little script, and show me the title, quantity, and the number of the cost of the books we sold in total. So very standard, as if KSS didn't exist. I'll go ahead, turn on my JavaScript, refresh my page, and now I can just push that little update button. No full page request. I get the answer back immediately. Very similar to last time. Skip the normal behavior, call the script, tell us which book you want to update. That's the same as we did last time, basically. It's the same kind of piece. The difference is this time, rather than showing you the KSS script as a through the web or on-disk product Plone 2 CMF style Python script, now I'm showing it to you as a ZOP3 view. There's no reason to prefer one or the other per se for KSS. KSS works great both ways. As a ZOP3 view, we have a base class called Plone KSS view. If you subclass from that, then you get to leave out some of that little dead chicken waving boilerplate at the top and the bottom. It just saves you a few lines of typing. I have a little marker that says this is a KSS action. Actionify this method. So again, do the work. Do a core command. I'll talk about these command sets in a few moments, but understand that KSS offers you a few different kinds of commands. The ones that are straightforward, like replacing HTML, are in a set called core. You've seen that word once or twice before so far. And then replace how many copies, replace the cost. It's the same kind of script. This is just what it looks like as a ZOP3 view. Again, we have the possibility of making a slightly smarter UI. It's a little annoying to have to push the update button. We might assume that our boss wants to get that automatically refreshed every few seconds, minutes, hours, pieces like that. Let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. I'm going to take away the update button behavior. I'm going to uncomment the lines that I have here. When KSS is present, hide the update button. You don't need it anymore because we're going to do this automatically. And every 2 seconds, do what I was doing before. 2 seconds is crazy fast, but I want it to look impressive in a presentation. Of course, this would drive your boss crazy in real life, which might be your goal, but that's up to you. So you can see up there, the refresh happens automatically without a full page request. Questions or problems? Yeah.
You mentioned that you might reach out, for example, and go get some data
Mhm.
somewhere. Just as a matter of practice, and this isn't necessarily related to this, are there any restrictions to what kind of data connections you can make?
I mean, KSS itself will just communicate with your ZOP server, though you can, I won't cover it here, but Godefroy will be covering it later, using external JSS, which gives you all sorts of other libraries and capabilities. But the sort of classic KSS I'm showing you here talks to your server. As far as what your server does, that's whatever you know how to do in Python. And that's the beauty of this, is you just write it in ordinary Plone Python. To the extent that you think Plone's Python is ordinary, you can do whatever you want to do there. There is another hand. Yeah?
Is it possible to, instead of doing the polling refresh thing, to have something streaming? So if you've got a long-running task, to have it sort of spit out a whole lot of data and have it come through.
There are a lot of possibilities I'm not showing you here that are a little outside the scope of the basic talk. You might choose, for example, to not reflash the numbers all the time, but to have the KSS action that gets fired every few seconds is check for some sort of signifier of change, and only if so actually do the recalculation, and only if so replace the HTML. The nice thing really is that nothing would change about my KSS. My KSS is just saying every 2 seconds ask for book update information. You're just adding non-KSS specific kind of logic to your Python. I know that's only about 2/3 your question, but let me ask if you can hold the last third till post. Okay. All right, we'll take a look at the updating script. And that's again, just so it's in your mind, subclassing Plone's KSS view and saying this is a KSS action, this is very boilerplate, do the work. And then I want to talk about these command sets in a second. So we'll see again that we're using the core one now. We're going to look in a moment in very ZOP Plone specific ones. I give you, as the reference here, I just want to walk you through the kind of things I'm leaving you with in the handouts. My cheat sheet for KSS, what are the events? This is total JavaScript-y basic stuff, so if you've done any JavaScript, you'll recognize these. They're very similar to most event-driven systems. Click, double click. Very useful when the page is loaded, do this immediately, which is how I've been doing all the hide the button because you don't need the button because you have KSS. Mouse up, mouse down, mouse over, mouse out. For putting the mouse over, moving the mouse away, you can look up the details in any JavaScript book. Entering, leaving a field, changing a field, dropping down a drop-down menu, submitting a form. What I used a moment ago for the every 2 seconds call the script, which is an automatic timeout. And that timeout can keep happening or can happen just once. And there are advanced ways to say, keep it happening and now stop it from happening. But the classic would be wait 1 minute and do it, or do it every 1 minute, or how often you want. Here are the common actions. Here are the common things you'll want to do. There are more. These are all in the core set. We call it the core set because it has nothing to do with ZOP and Plone. And in fact, KSS can totally be used outside of ZOP and Plone. It's just a bunch of JavaScript, except for the parts that are ZOP Plone specific that are broken out. So the core stuff is very generic, replacing HTML, inserting HTML, deleting nodes, which is how we delete parts of HTML, like getting rid of those buttons and elements we don't need. Whoops. Adding CSS classes to your HTML, removing it, super useful, toggling it. So, thank you. So if you want to toggle on, lit up, visible, hidden, whatever, changing your CSS classes is super useful for that kind of, when you push this button, light this up. You can add, remove, change those CSS classes. Move the form focus, a classic JavaScript-y sort of action. Pull up error messages, pull up logging messages, pull up the classic JavaScript alert box. The places, I mentioned this idea briefly, that we have parameter providers when you want your KSS to push something, like how I said we could get the number of copies of the book you want from the form and push that to your script. what are the common providers, get things from any form, get things from the current form that you're already inside, get any node arbitrarily from your HTML, get the content of any node, and there are many more, but those are the classic ones. The core stuff is all the things I've shown you, the set class, set attributes, and so on. We have a handful of things in the ZOP set. So instead of importing the core set, you can import the ZOP set. And the most common and useful of those is refreshing a viewlet. For those who don't know, viewlets are essentially the snippets of pages in Plone 3, like the footer, the search box, the user bar, things like that. And if you want to update the footer when something happens or change the user bar when something happens, you can ask ZOP to refresh that viewlet using code like this. There's a refresh viewlet action in the ZOP set, and then we'll tell it what the viewlet is, what the manager is, and where we're getting that information. You'll look that up, but it's super useful as you get intermediate because it lets you have dynamic, smart replacements without having to know the HTML really well or be really dependent on your current HTML, because viewlets can move, change, and such as themers come and recomposite Plone pages. And then, probably the highest level of them, refreshing entire portlets without knowing anything about that portlet, changing the portlet itself. This is in the Plone set because portlets are Plone things, not just general ZOP things. We have refresh portlet. We tell it what portlet we want, and we can get that very easily. I give you an example in the working code of how I do that. Here's an example of this working. My secret number is currently 62, and I can change that. It's a little hard to see, but that number's changing. I'm not changing that by having KSS that changes just that number. I'm actually refreshing that entire portlet. So if that were a news portlet or a review portlet or a collection portlet, I'm regenerating that entire portlet. I don't have to know anything about what's inside of it or be dependent on what that portlet's HTML is. We also have the ability to issue a portal message, the little orange bar that pops up that says thank you or warning or such, which is a Plone-specific piece. I've got a break in about 2 minutes. I've got about 2 slides left. You can debug KSS most easily with Firebug. Firebug will show you tons of debugging messages from KSS. You just have to turn on the debugging mode for Portal JavaScript. And that's the way you signify, I would like debugging information from KSS. You can also type your script URL in directly. It's sort of obvious once you've thought about it, but it can be very elusive to think about it the first time. I have that KSS order calculate script. Type it into the URL bar and see what I get back. And this is what I get back. I get back some XML of what KSS said should happen. Cookit was the old name for KSS. It was a terrible name, and it was also a devastating Norwegian obscenity, so we changed it to KSS. It's an odd bit of trivia, but important in our community, given our co-founder. But you can type in your URL and get back the exact message and see what's happening and debug what's happening. What's the future here? Well, people will use KSS with other libraries, with the next library, whatever comes after jQuery. You don't have to know, you don't have to care, your KSS doesn't have to change. That's the beauty of this abstraction. This is total science fiction, so don't ask when the lightning talk on it is, but somebody could write a backend that's not JavaScript for KSS. Somebody could write a Flash backend, for example. KSS is specifying the behavior you want at a high level of abstraction. It's not related to the technology that actually makes the changes. So there's an interesting possibility of other ways of implementing those behavioral specifications. In any event, though, it should give you a chance to get a lot more interactivity without having to learn JavaScript or maintain that JavaScript. We are about at time. I'll be happy to take questions up front post the session. The handouts for this are already uploaded at plonebootcamps.com/resources, as well as a ZOP product called KSS Techniques, which is the working code you've actually seen. Thank you very, very much. I will tell you that if you're interested in learning more and playing with this, it just so happens that KSS and KSSifying the Plone Help Center is the topic of the beginner sprint on Saturday and Sunday. So if you want a chance to try this out live, help a real product, and learn about sprinting, come to part of the sprint and work with John and I on having used this technology to make our help center better. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. If you have questions, feel free to grab me now. Or